Before I begin, I want to make a little story here that's sort of germane to my talk. I was in New Jersey giving some presentations, and one of the venues was a comedy club. So some wise guy said, well, you got to tell a joke. I said, well, I'll tell something that's sort of germane to the topic. And there was this hermit, lived in the woods, stayed away from the civilization for the most part, but every so often he'd travel into town and trade furs or whatever he could for supplies. And one particular winter, he got a terrible sprained ankle, so he couldn't get to town, couldn't get around very much, but what he would do is he would throw feed in front of his cabin, and whatever showed up, you know, bird or whatever, he would just blam away, and that would be his meal. Well, one particular day, unbeknownst to him, and by the way, this stuff does happen, there was some environmental activists doing little energy audits and seeing what was going on. And they noticed that as he threw his seed out, a spotted owl landed, and he shot the spotted owl. So within about 2 hours, some black helicopters are circling around his cabin, and guys are coming out in these ninja outfits and black automatic weapons, surround the cabin. And he was a very peaceful man. He wasn't resisting at all. How do you resist at 1 against 80 anyway? So he was arrested, put in chains, irons, hauled in front of a federal judge. Black robe, intimidating man, high behind the bench, and there's this poor guy, you know, destitute, little cabin, no money, and the man realized, I have no money, I'm going to throw myself at the mercy of the court and plead guilty. So the judge said, you're here for violating the Endangered Species Act. How do you plead? Your Honor, I plead guilty, but I have some mitigating circumstances. I had an injury, as you notice, I've been limping in here, and I had sustenance, so that's why I did that. The judge looked at him. The judge's been on the bench for 30 years, and he said, this is the first time anyone's ever pled guilty in my court. He says, I'm going to go lenient. I'm going to be lenient with you. This is phenomenal. I'm going to give you a 10-year suspended sentence and a $100,000 fine. But if I ever see you in my courtroom again, you're going to jail for a long time. So the guy's bowing to the judge, and he's walking out the door, and the judge says, just one more question for you. Yes, Your Honor. I'm curious. What does a spotted owl taste like? He says, well, Your Honor, it tastes a little bit like a cross between a bald eagle and a condor. Okay. First off, I have to explain. Agenda 21, 21 means the 21st century. And the thrust of Agenda 21 is to transform traditional individual property rights into collective property rights. And it's based upon the premise that government planning should replace the Western understanding of private stewardship. Now, we know there's environmental problems. No one's denying that. But we believe the best way to solve them is at the local, regional level perhaps, and through private property. See, when's the last time you saw somebody put motor oil in their swimming pool? When it's private property, people respect that property. And people who own property tend to respect other people's property, and they also respect public property. You know, you see a Greenpeace concert or an Earth Day concert, and in the wake of that, it's pretty disgusting. But a Tea Party rally or a 9/12 rally, usually in the wake of that, it's pretty clean. Why? Because people who own things usually respect others. And here's a very important book that came out by the Rand Institute, Troubled Lands, The Legacy of Soviet Environmental Destruction. Why was there environmental destruction in the Soviet Union? There was no private property and no contract law, you see. And that goes for other countries too, Cuba, Communist China. Now, it's important to point out, now at the end of the presentation I give some specific examples of how Agenda 22 is affecting you. Let me start off with the light bulb. Did you know that the incandescent light bulb that really brought us out of darkness, out of the lamp, the oil lamps and whale oil and so forth, has been banned by Congress. In 2014, they will no longer be manufactured in the United States. Okay, you can probably still buy them, what's left of it, but you go to some of the big warehouse stores, they're out of them by now. Now, why is that? Well, folks, it's unsustainable, you see. They're not very efficient. So the EPA will mandate that you buy the mercury-filled compact fluorescent bulbs. Now, have you ever read a label of one of these when you bought one? If you break this, they want you to call an 800 number, a hazmat team, right? Now, a hazmat team, I'd never had a hazmat team come to my house. I couldn't afford it. When you break an incandescent light bulb, it's inconvenient, but it's not really all that dangerous. But when you break one of these babies, you're going to have some mercury on your hands. Now, the free market system says, look, we have this light bulb at 35 cents a piece, doesn't last as long. We have this other one, it's going to last you longer, but it's going to cost a lot more. If it breaks, you're in for trouble. You make that determination when you buy that product, right? That's what free people do. That's not what Congress does, okay? And by the way, when this bill was passed, this congressional bill that was signed by President Obama, it said it was called something to do about American independence, energy independence. You see what a fraud it is? And most of these bulbs are made in communist China, and they're using rare earth materials that are very hard to find and only available in a few countries too. Okay, now, green technology, green jobs, green this, green that. We've been overcome by this nonsense of green. The electric car is going to replace the internal combustion engine. That's what we're told. Well, I got a chance to visit the Henry Ford Museum this past August, my second trip or third trip there. And you know what they had on display? They had a 1915 hybrid. It was battery as the initial source and gasoline as the backup. They just reversed it. Here's a picture of a battery-powered car in 1904, a German battery-powered car. They weren't efficient then. They're not very efficient today. $70,000 to $100,000 for your typical battery-powered car. It takes you between 6 to 8 hours to recharge it. And you get a range of, I've heard some people say 80 miles to about 200 miles. Not very efficient, especially if you're doing a lot of driving like I do, right? Does it have limited application? Sure it does. Will it become the technology of the future? Maybe. But it's subsidized by the federal and state governments, and that's the biggest problem. If the free market can, inventors and scientists can come up with a way to make this profitable, they will. You don't have to have subsidized recharging stations. When's the last time you saw a subsidized gas station anywhere? Right? So let the free market worry about the electric car. By the way, Al Gore, you'll hear his name once or twice during this presentation. Just so happens that he has interest in a company that makes these things that happens to be federally subsidized, right? What about when these solar panels? I haven't got a chance to put it up there yet, but I have a list of solar companies that have gone bankrupt in the last 2 years. All of them subsidized by us, the taxpayer. I have nothing against solar panels. If you want to buy them, put them on your house. In fact, if I had the money, I probably would put a few in my home. Although there's dangers to these too, by the way. This is not going to be the wave of the future. You know, I've seen some of these so-called solar farms. They take up lots and lots of acreage for a little bit of energy. A very little bit. They catch fire, and I didn't learn this in high school science, but the sun goes down sometimes. And you don't have that much solar energy, right? And you can't store this stuff like you can a can of gasoline, right? And again, it's subsidized by the federal government and state governments. What about wind technology? Now, I heard a commercial on the radio. It was one of these government-sponsored ad council. They mentioned that the light bulb was a great invention in 1880, whatever it was. And so wasn't carrier pigeon. Ha, ha, ha. But now we have new technology. Well, their new technology actually is several thousand years old, like the windmill. Here's an example of 1st century AD. So we're talking 2,000 years of age, right? Now, you see a whole bunch of these babies as you were coming in here, right? I'm not sure what these cost, the ones out here, but the average large wind turbine is $1.3 million. It's supposed to last 14 years, and I've met people in these presentations that have actually worked on these things, or consultants. They say 7 years is more like it, sometimes less. You see they catch fire, the hydraulic fluid, the gears wear out. I met a gentleman who's an engineer. He said they just fixed one, $500,000 to repair some gears, because you're going up 40 stories and what have you. It's not like you take a toolbox and you're done in a couple of hours. The wind doesn't always blow, and I think most of you, I'm sure all of you know that, but some folks probably who support this don't realize that. You put it on the side of, you put it on top of a mountain, you have to clear cut. You know, if you're a local hiking group and you want to put a little path, oh, they won't let you. Oh no, that's conservation land, you can't do that. Oh, but we want to put some wind turbines. Oh, why didn't you say so? they have to have access roads with huge cranes, right? And would you know most of these, where they're made? Yes, most of them are made in China, that's right. So the bailout money that we had to borrow from China was used to buy stuff from China, right? So is there room for these? Well, if it was subsidized by the private sector, right? And if, for example, I have a friend of mine whose son, he manages a company that makes the smaller ones, the ones you see on these farms and what have you, $30,000. And he said, Dad, some of my clients don't care if these things work, as long as they look like they're going green. He said, why don't you just make fake ones? He said, we can make fake ones and sell them for a profit. My son suggests you have solar-paneled wind turbines. You know? I tell people, my dear late mother, I didn't realize it, but she was a greenie before Al Gore was around. Why? Because we had something called a solar dryer, otherwise known as a clothesline, right? I guarantee you won't see clotheslines in some of these bedroom communities that embrace Agenda 21. I guarantee it. Now, how about recycling? I think recycling, for the most part, is a good thing if it's market-driven. In other words, if the free market can take this bottle and turn it into something, you reuse it or do something else with it for a profit without using more energy, then it's a good thing. That means I should get paid for my recycled things, right? We used to, when I was a little guy, we used to recycle 2 cents for a Coke bottle. We used to just wash them and reuse them. There was no laws that you had to do it. No bottle, no deposit law. Many times, though, when you recycle something, it takes more energy to recycle it. You're better off just throwing it away. So this notion that recycling is, in fact, the cities are making lots of money off these recycling things when they do become profitable. I took my son, Nathaniel, to a, what was it called, a trash museum. And it actually was a huge recycling place in Hartford, Connecticut. And they say they actually make money. They contract with the cities and they make money. And they showed how they used the glass and all that. Very, very efficient. But this mantra about recycling to save the planet isn't quite the way it works out. Now, let's get into a couple of very important documents. How many people in this room have read the U.S. Constitution? Just about everybody in this room, right? Pretty easy to read, not a whole lot of pages. How about the UN Charter? How many people have read the UN Charter? One? Nobody. Nobody's read the UN Charter. Well, I tell people in rooms that are kind of hostile, don't like what I have to say, and haven't read the UN Charter, I say, well, you better be familiar with the document that's going to run your country if you embrace this Agenda 21. The UN Charter is the opposite of the U.S. Constitution, diametrically opposite of each other. And why is that? Well, the U.S. Constitution did not give us anything. Did you know people say I have a Second Amendment right and the First Amendment right? I know it's an NRA guy with a Second Amendment didn't give us a right. It protects a right that belonged to us. If a government can give you a right, it can take it away. Well, the UN Charter and the documents that come out of the UN, one of the most notorious is called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, 1948. 1984 would be more appropriate for its Orwellian concept. In that, you have the right to a vacation. Isn't that nice? The right to freely travel. The right of association. The right to a job. The right to this, the right to that. But if you go down to Article 28 or 29, all of those rights can be taken away from you if there's a law against those rights. And guess what? You're not supposed to criticize the UN under the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In other words, it's a fraud, folks. So there's another document. How many people have read the Communist Manifesto? If you've been to a New York State college, you've probably got a professor who probably agrees with this, right? There are 10 planks. You can find this on PDF. It's not hard to get. And for a communist, it's kind of a thin document. There are 10 planks, and the very first plank is abolition of property, means private property. That is Agenda 21 in a nutshell, okay? Everything in Agenda 21 is compatible to the Communist Manifesto. A heavy progressive income tax, industrial armies, and what have you. Here is the headquarters. Someone said, does it look like a tomb? Well, it probably does look like a tomb. Now, this is down here in New York City. We refer to this as the house that is built. Now, there are a lot of people who mean well, They've 2 generations of public schools where they've learned that this is a benevolent organization, mankind's last and best hope for peace. And they can't believe that anyone has any objections to this. And even those that do, some of them say, look, Hal, the UN is just a waste. They're just a bunch of idiots. They have no influence and nothing to worry about. They're incompetent. Well, I wish they were. Okay. I'm sure there are some incompetent people at the UN, but they're not the ones wreaking havoc around the world. This map we just came out with actually is in one of the reprints I just showed you. And I have this in a JPEG too if you're interested. This is just an example of UN activity all over the world. Okay. And as I mentioned earlier, they're going to be monitoring our elections. Okay. Well, the UN Charter had to be written by somebody. It didn't evolve from a swamp. Well, who wrote it? Most people don't know. I've actually spoken to UN officials, have no idea that the man who wrote the UN Charter was a man named Al Shurtleff. You see the picture in the middle? That's his prison garb because he was found guilty for perjury. He was a Soviet agent. That used to mean something. This was during the time of Stalin's regime. He was a Stalinist, folks. A man from upper middle class privilege, and there's nothing wrong with upper middle class background. He went to Columbia University where he became a communist. Again, I'm not talking about a liberal, I'm not talking about a progressive, I'm talking about a Soviet agent, okay? He was an advisor to Franklin Roosevelt at Yalta. That's how influential he was. And he was the first acting General Secretary of the United Nations. So I asked the question, what good can come from this man's pen? I would think nothing. Okay, now, here's a picture that you probably didn't see on your daily newspaper when it came out. You didn't see this video clip on your news when it happened. This was in Somalia back in the mid-90s. You see 2 white guys? And they're holding a black guy over a fire. Right? This isn't Rodney King, folks. This is a Somalian national. He's a civilian. And these 2 soldiers are, I believe they're from Holland. They are under UN command. And I believe what they've done, they were ordered to do. And they're having a lot of fun. You notice they're smiling? I served in the military, and one of the first things we learn in basic training is that we never obey an unlawful order. This is an unlawful order. We would say no. We would refuse, because we're supposed to be different than the rest of the world. We don't engage in torture. We don't do things of this nature. My late father was in Germany when Hermann Goering was captured. He actually saw him. They didn't do this to Hermann Goering. I would say that Hermann Goering had a few more things worse than this guy. This guy was probably just a bystander. Okay? Gatanga back in the early 60s. Everybody familiar with that? You didn't learn this in your UN model at school, did you? Gatanga was a province of what used to be called the Belgian Congo, now Zaire. The country was turned over to a thug that was trained in Moscow by the name of Patrice Lumumba. A province, like a state, had seceded. It was led by a black man, a pro-Western man. There were blacks, whites, Jews, Muslims, Christians living in this province in relative peace. A small but growing middle class. But they had uranium, folks. That was wanted. So the UN violated its charter, all the values enshrined in the charter, and they bombed hospitals, they murdered and raped civilians. And this is just one of the few slides that I could show to to an audience like this. And and by the way, mostly white soldiers this time around from Ireland who did this nasty stuff. This is something recent. More UN soldiers. Remember that movie Hotel Rwanda? It was a pretty horrible movie, wasn't it? I mean, it was a good movie as far as exposing it, but they didn't tell the whole story. They didn't tell you that there was a Canadian general who was a decent man that got wind of this forthcoming potential genocide. He tried to stop it. He had to get permission from the UN civilian mission, the man who headed the UN civilian mission. He said, no way. In fact, some of the trucks were used to bring the Tutsis to the Hutus. There were some of these poor people that said to the UN soldiers, shoot us and shoot my family. I'd rather be shot than be hacked to death with a machete. That man, by the way, that said no, Kofi Annan, okay, who later became head of the UN and got the Nobel Peace Prize. What a mockery. Did I make my case against the UN? Just a little bit? I hope so. Here's a book that came out in the late 90s. Oh, by the way, I showed that story about the black man that was being tortured. That story was not broken by the, it came out by the John Birch Society. It came out by the Village Voice. They're the ones that broke that story. So you got a lot of people on the left that don't like what's going on either. In fact, there's a group against Agenda 21 called Democrats Against UN Agenda 21. Do a little search. So when you have your liberal friends, or if you're a liberal in this room, you say, oh, it's just a bunch of right-wingers. There are some left-wingers, too, that don't like this. And God bless them. Death by Government was written by a professor from University of Hawaii, Mr. Professor R.G. Romo. It came out in the late 90s. And he said that more people have been killed by their governments in peacetime in the 20th century than all the wars in the 20th century. Okay? And I could add to that most of these nations are members in good standing at the UN. Okay, Hal, all right. So maybe the UN does have a little bit of excess, but they've done such great work. They've helped the poor. They feed the hungry. Yes, the people that, the policies that they enact cause the hunger and poverty. But here's a book written by a British journalist, Lords of Poverty, that talks about the UN lending institutions. They lend, I mean, they get the money from us and they give it to third world dictators. They prop them up and they cause all kinds of problems. And on top of that, you remember the Brazilian rainforest that was being depleted? Where'd that money come from? Where'd it come from? Piggy banks of people in Brazil? It came from the International Monetary Fund. In other words, it came from us, the taxpayers of the United States. And their own doctors, their own soil experts, agronomists said, this is not going to be good soil for what you want to grow here. But when you get billions of dollars coming down from the UN, it's hard to say no, especially if you're a corrupt third world dictator. Okay, let's get into Agenda 21. Back in 1976, there was a meeting in Vancouver, British Columbia. The Commission on Sustainable Development's, what was it called? Habitat for Humanity. They advocated that all countries should establish as a matter of urgency a national policy on human settlements embodying the distribution of population over national territory. Okay, so they want to relocate people around the world, get them out of the forest, get them out of the country, put them in these little communities. So this was a long time ago, long before the term Agenda 20 was used. 1986, Our Common Future, the World Commission on Environment and Development, chaired by a very brilliant woman, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who's still very much at it today. She was at Rio Plus 20, and we actually interviewed her. One of our colleagues who was down in Rio interviewed her. And she also happened to be the vice president of the World Socialists. She wasn't vice president of the John Birch Society or the von Mises Foundation or vice president of the local Tea Party group. She was the vice president of the World Socialists. There's a good reason for that, because this is socialism. It's what they advocated. Well, this is where the term sustainable development, now it's an old word. Sustainable is not a bad word, by the way. You have to have sustainable business practices. This is the fraudulent stuff. You hear about a farm that's been in business for 5 generations. All of a sudden, they bought it as sustainable farming. Well, guy, your great-great-great-grandpappy was here, and you're still here. You must be doing something right, right? That's sustainable. You don't need money from the government to do something you've been doing right along. But people like that government money. They take it, and they, I'm bought into it. I'm going green. So, sustainable development, the official definition is something like this: to meet the needs of this present generation without infringing on the needs of future generations. Now, it almost sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Well, of course I want things for my children and my grandchildren. That's why farmers, people who tree farmers will plant trees. They know they're not going to harvest them because it might take 40 to 60 years. Their grandchildren will harvest them. Or whoever buys the farm down the road, right? That's good stewardship. And they use the term need too, don't they? Not wants or desires. How many people here need a Cadillac? No. You might need a bicycle to get to work. Right? How many people need a steak, or shrimp? No, you might need mush for sustenance. So the term need is an economic term, basic necessities, as opposed to wants and desires, right? Here is a picture of the conference in 1992, in June of 1992. At this meeting, there were about 50,000 people from around the world. Leaders from about 170 nations. Even the Beach Boys were there. You had a lot of celebrities. And my colleague who wrote this article was on hand, and he said there were socialists, communists, globalists, and diapered swamis. little sense of humor there. He actually pointed out that there were these indigenous people doing their native dance. He actually saw that the same people in Rome. So Renta Swami is what he called it. I think is what he called it. And I say there were two diapered swamis that are known to us at this conference, Al Gore and John Kerry. Both of them at the time were U.S. senators. One was vice president. Al Gore made about $1 billion. He's now a billionaire. Now, I've got nothing against billionaires. I wouldn't mind being one myself. It's what you do with the money and how you made it I might have an issue with. He had a lot of money to begin with because his daddy was a lapdog for Arm & Hammer, who sold oil, folks. Yeah, internal combustion engines and all that good stuff. That's what he did with that oil. And Al Gore made most of his money lying to school children about global warming. I got a chance to go to a conference, and 2 years in a row in New York City. I met some of the top scientists in every conceivable discipline dealing with global warming. From polar bear specialists to disease-borne specialists to, you name it, insect-borne specialists. And Al Gore would not debate any scientist on the subject of global warming. And if he was speaking here today, and you were a reporter, your questions would have to be pre-selected. And not anyone just show up and get press credentials. Only those he allows in. So it's an intellectual closed shop with Al Gore. And he was at Agenda 21 and completely. Have you ever read his book, Earth in the Balance? Pretty rotten stuff. So here is, I mentioned this book a little while ago. Effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. A major shift in the priorities of both governments and individuals and an unprecedented redeployment of human and financial resources. This shift will demand that a concern for the environmental consequences of every human action be integrated into individual and collective decision-making at every level. Yeah, other than that, it doesn't have much. Folks, this is a blueprint for total government. Obamacare is in Agenda 21, okay? Massachusetts has a question on the ballot about assisted suicide. You see, they don't want too many people around. We may even defeat it in Massachusetts. But let me show you how Chapter 28 of Agenda 21 deals with how local communities and how you folks can implement it, you see. But there's a chapter on women. You see, women, what's that got to do with Agenda 21? Well, women have children. And if you destroy the families, you won't have as many children because children are not sustainable. Large families are not sustainable in their eyes. But actually, large families are good. And China is feeling the pinch of this one-child policy, the social consequences, right? But here is how ridiculous it is. Programs and activities. Programs should be developed to promote the reduction of the heavy workload of women and girl children at home. So guys, you need to do laundry more often. Okay? Be good husbands. Be good sons. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. But it just shows you how totally intrusive it is. Like, I need someone from the UN to tell me to be a good husband, right? Ridiculous. Now, who are the people that gave us Agenda 21? Here's one of the grandpappies. We should know a little bit about him if we're going to embrace his worldview and his philosophy and his law. Maurice Strong, at the age of 18, was nothing but a mere passcode clerk at the UN. Nothing wrong with being a passcode clerk. I wish that's where he stayed being, by the way. By the time he's 25, he's leading a major oil company. How did he do that? Night school and working hard at the convenience stores. No, he became a friend of David Rockefeller. Maurice Strong said at the Rio conference that the biggest threat to the world is the American middle class. How many people fit that description? Yeah, one or two, right? And why is that? Single-family homes, consumption patterns. How many people are going to go home and your house is going to be warm? It's what, in the low 40s? You can have what, oil or gas for the most part, that your home. Or if it was hot out, you're going to go home to air conditioning. All unsustainable. And how many people had red meat today? Unsustainable. Oh, wow. These people are serious, by the way. And in 1990, he was interviewed by a reporter for a magazine called West out of British Columbia. I could not find the original article, although I think I had one when it first came out. But you can find this quote all over the place. He's talking about writing a novel. you know, like novel based on truth, like Philip Drew Administrator. If you haven't heard that, I'll let you know about it after the presentation. Isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilization collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? He went on to say, oh, but I shouldn't be talking about that. And this poor reporter, probably some young guy, and he's thinking, this guy can do it. He's the head of the World Economic Forum. And by the way, Maurice, he owns property all over the world. He drives around in a big limousine. He's living in China right now. I think he should stay there. He's also a devotee of the New Age movement. And that's his right. He can be a New Ager. But it's interesting that you never see these media pundits ridicule the New Agers. They go after Christianity all the time, don't they? Oh, they hate Christians. You know, but they have no trouble with New Agers like Mr. Maurice Strong. I mean, Hillary Clinton used to hold seances in the White House to conjure up the spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt. Now she's Secretary of State. No one, very little people talk about that. How about Jacques Cousteau? We've all heard of Jacques Cousteau, haven't we? The Endless World of Jacques Cousteau. I used to watch the show as a child. I don't know if it's still on. Maybe it is. Maybe in reruns or for TV Land or whatever it is. He was also at Rio. And by the way, when they say these things, they're widely applauded by the attendees. He said in the bottom, at this event, the bottom paragraph, an American-born child, environmentally is too expensive to his or her adulthood in a world economy. The term world economy means socialist economy. American women must be subjected to some manner of regulation beyond licensing and mandatory abortion practices. You ladies okay with that? You want the UN and their subdivisions and their local people that say how many children you should have? And forced abortions? Well, they have it in China. They certainly do. 7 months prior to the summit, he was interviewed in UNESCO Courier, which is a publication, United Nations Education, Science, Cultural Organization. See, the UN doesn't just want world peace. They want the culture, they want the education, they want everything, folks. They even want your souls. They have a UN meditation room at the headquarters. You know who funds it? The Lucius Trust. It used to be called the Lucifer Trust, but Lucifer has got some bad, he needs some better PR. It just turns some people off. So, anyway, he says this in this Courier. You can find this online, by the way, this November 1991. One American tires the earth much more than 20 Bangladeshis. World population must be stabilized, and to do that we must eliminate 350,000 people per day. And he went on to say, it's a terrible thing to say, but it's worse not to say it. Now, he's since deceased, but they're funny, they don't volunteer themselves. So, Agenda 21 isn't just about property rights, it's about population redistribution, population control.